Jake Matthews couldn't believe his eyes as he read the document in his hands. The translation from the flowing, swirling Trelaxian script into English did nothing to make the words more believable. His friend, Han, was dead. "This can't be right," Jake muttered, looking up at the Trelaxian ambassador who stood before him in the softly lit memorial chamber. Ambassador Tay's iridescent skin shifted colors slightly as she tilted her head, a gesture Jake had learned meant mild confusion. "The translation is accurate, Dr. Matthews. Han's final wishes are quite clear." Jake ran a hand through his dark hair, still struggling to process the news. Han had been more than just a colleague at the Earth Trelaxian diplomatic outpost. For 3 years, the alien xenobiologist had been Jake's closest friend, teaching him about Trelaxian culture while Jake had helped Han understand humans. They'd shared meals, stories, and countless hours of research together. And now Han was gone, killed during what should have been a routine expedition to the Crescent Mountains on the Trelaxian homeworld. "I understand his death is difficult to accept," Ambassador Ta continued, her voice musical with the distinctive Trelaxian resonance. "But there are matters that must be addressed promptly, according to our customs." Jake looked around the memorial chamber. The room was filled with both humans and Trelaxians, all gathered to honor Han's memory. Holographic images of Han floated around the room, showing him during happier times, working in the lab, hiking Earth's mountains, even one of him and Jake sharing a meal in the outpost cafeteria. "Of course," Jake nodded, trying to be respectful despite his grief. "What needs to be done?" Ambassador Ta gestured to the document. "As per Trelaxian law and Han's explicit wishes, his 3 sisters now pass to you as his chosen bond brother." Jake blinked, certain he had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "You are now responsible for Ju, Sun, and Jin, Han's sisters. Under our laws, this makes them your wives." The words hung in the air between them. Jake felt a sudden coldness in his stomach, like he'd swallowed ice water. That's not possible," Jake stammered. "There must be some mistake. Han never mentioned having sisters, and I certainly can't. I mean, I don't even know them." Ambassador Tay's skin rippled with colors that Jake recognized as sympathy mixed with firmness. Han kept his family private, as many Trelaxians do when working off-world. But he spoke often of you to them. In his final testament, he named you his bond brother, the highest honor one Trelaxian can bestow upon a non-family member. Jake's mind raced. In 3 years of friendship, Han had taught him much about Trelaxian culture, but nothing about this aspect of their laws. "But surely this doesn't apply to humans. I'm not bound by Trelaxian law. The treaty between our worlds includes recognition of certain cultural practices," Ambassador Ta explained patiently. "This is one of them. Han would not have made this choice if he did not believe you worthy and capable." Before Jake could protest further, Ambassador Ta made a graceful gesture toward the back of the chamber. "They have traveled far to meet you." 3 tall, slender figures moved forward through the crowd. Like all Trelaxians, they had the distinctive iridescent skin that seemed to shift colors with their emotions. They were humanoid but clearly alien, with elongated limbs, large almond-shaped eyes, and no visible hair. All 3 wore the traditional flowing garments that Trelaxians preferred. As they approached, Jake could see subtle differences between them. The tallest had skin that shifted between blues and greens, while another's skin held tones of purple and silver. The third, slightly smaller than her sisters, had a golden glow to her pearlescent skin. "Dr. Matthews," Ambassador Ta said formally, "may I present Ju, Sun, and Jin, the sisters of Han, and now, by his will and our law, your wives." The 3 Trelaxians bowed their heads slightly in the traditional greeting. Jake, feeling as though he were in some bizarre dream, automatically returned the gesture. "This is Ju." Ambassador Ta indicated the tallest with the blue-green skin. "She is a scientist like her brother, specializing in xenobotany." Ju's eyes, large and completely black like all Trelaxians, studied Jake with obvious intelligence. Han spoke highly of your work, Dr. Matthews, she said, her voice deeper than the ambassador's, but with the same musical quality. This is Sun, the ambassador continued, gesturing to the one with purple-silver skin. She serves in our planetary defense forces. Sun gave a curt nod, her posture noticeably straighter than her sister's. There was something intimidating about her, despite the flowing robes she wore. And this is Jin, the youngest. The golden-skinned Trelaxian stepped forward with a grace that made her seem to float. Jin is an empath and cultural liaison. Jin's eyes seemed somehow warmer than her sister's, though they were the same obsidian black. We share in your grief for Han, she said softly. He valued your friendship greatly. Jake stood frozen, unsure what to say or do. These 3 alien women were now supposedly his wives. It had to be some kind of misunderstanding or cultural miscommunication. I'm honored to meet Han's family, he finally managed to say. But there must be some way to respect his wishes without honoring our ways. Sun asked, her voice carrying a slight edge. Jake flushed. That's not what I meant. It's just that humans don't. We don't inherit people. Marriage is a personal choice for us. For Trelaxians, family bonds transcend individual choice, Chu explained, her tone academic and measured. They are sacred connections, especially when formed through the last wishes of a loved one. Ambassador Ta placed a 6-fingered hand on Jake's shoulder. Perhaps this is a discussion best continued in private. The ceremony has concluded, and I imagine you all have much to discuss. Jake looked around and realized that most of the mourners had already left the chamber. Only a few human diplomats remained, watching the scene with poorly disguised curiosity. This cannot be happening, Jake whispered, more to himself than anyone else. Jin stepped closer, her golden skin glowing softly in the dim light. We understand this is unexpected for you, Jake Matthews. Han prepared us for your confusion. He said humans view bonds differently than we do. Did he also tell you I might refuse? Jake asked, immediately regretting his bluntness. The 3 sisters exchanged looks that Jake couldn't interpret. To refuse would bring great dishonor to us. Sun said stiffly. We would be considered abandoned, unworthy of family bonds. In practical terms, Ju added, we would face exile from our community. Han knew this, which is why he chose someone he trusted completely. Jake felt trapped between cultures, between respecting his friend's last wishes and the absurdity of suddenly having 3 alien wives. He looked at the document again, at Han's signature symbol at the bottom of the page, and felt a profound sense of loss mixed with confusion. I need time to think, he said finally. This is a lot to process. Of course, Ambassador Ta nodded. But I must inform you that under the treaty, you have 3 Earth days to formally accept or refuse this responsibility. After that time, the sisters' status will become uncertain. Jake looked at the 3 Trelaxian women who were now, by their laws, his family. They had just lost their brother, and now their entire future depended on his decision. 3 days, he repeated quietly. I understand. Jake stood in the doorway of his apartment, keycard still in hand, watching as 3 Trelaxian females explored his living space. The diplomatic housing unit had seemed spacious enough for 1 person. With 4 occupants, it felt impossibly small. Your dwelling is minimal, Ju observed, running a 6-fingered hand along Jake's apartment wall. Her blue-green skin reflected in the white paint, casting subtle hues across the surface. I wasn't expecting company, Jake replied, watching as Sun examined his bookshelf with obvious disdain, and Jin curled herself into his reading chair. He had insisted on taking them to his home, rather than accepting the ambassador's offer of temporary quarters. If he was going to figure this out, he needed familiar surroundings. Sun picked up a book on xenobiology, flipping through the pages before placing it back on the shelf with a small sound that might have been disappointment. Han spoke highly of your adaptability, she said, her voice deeper than her sister's. He believed you would handle this transition with grace. Jake closed the door and dropped his bag on the small kitchen counter. The memorial service had been that morning, and now, 12 hours later, he still felt like he was dreaming, or having a nightmare. "Would you like refreshment?" Jin asked from his reading chair. "We brought traditional morning tea." She indicated a silver container on his coffee table that hadn't been there when he left that morning. Somehow they had already been in his apartment before he arrived. "No, thank you," Jake said, then immediately felt rude. "Maybe later. I'm still processing." Ju had moved to his window, looking out at the diplomatic compound. The Earth Trilaxian Cooperative Center housed about 200 humans and 100 Trilaxians, all working together on scientific and cultural exchange. Jake had loved his job as a xenoanthropologist, studying Trilaxian culture and helping ease interactions between the species, until today. "We understand this arrangement is unexpected," Ju said, turning from the window. Her large dark eyes studied him with scientific interest, as if he were a specimen. "Han should have prepared you." "Did he prepare you?" Jake asked. "Did you know about this plan before he died?" The three sisters exchanged looks. Some form of communication seemed to pass between them, though Jake couldn't tell if it was cultural or some kind of telepathy. Han had never been clear about whether Trilaxians possessed psychic abilities. "We knew it was possible," Sun finally answered. "As unmarried females with a single male sibling, we understood that his death would place our care in someone else's hands. We did not know he had chosen you specifically until the reading of his will." Jake walked to his kitchen and poured himself a glass of water. His hands shook slightly. In human culture, adults don't need caretakers. Women are independent, and no one inherits people. Jin unfolded her slender form from the chair and approached him, moving with a fluid grace that made her seem to float across the floor. "Han studied your customs extensively. He understood the differences between our worlds. He wouldn't have made this choice lightly." Jake sighed. "Look, on Earth, we don't inherit people. Marriage is a choice. And yet," Jin spoke softly, "on Trilax, family bonds transcend choice. They are destiny. If you reject us, we face exile." That word again, exile. Ambassador Ta had explained it briefly, but Jake had been too shocked to fully comprehend the implications. Now, looking at the three sisters standing in his small apartment, he tried to understand what it really meant. "What exactly happens if I decline this arrangement?" Sun's purple-silver skin darkened slightly, a sign of emotion that Jake couldn't interpret. "We would be considered abandoned. Without family bonds, we lose our place in society. No work, no housing, no community support." Ju nodded. "Our culture believes that those without family bonds lack the foundation for proper decision-making and social contribution. It is difficult to explain the full implications to someone not raised in our traditions." Jake rubbed his temples. "I need time." "Time," Ju nodded, "is something we can give." An awkward silence fell over the apartment. Jake realized they were waiting for direction from him. As their supposed new husband, they expected him to tell them what to do next. "I guess we should figure out sleeping arrangements," he said reluctantly. "I only have the one bedroom." "We require minimal rest compared to humans," Ju explained. 4 hours per Earth cycle is sufficient. We can alternate sleep periods," Sun added. "This dwelling, while small, is adequate for our temporary needs." Jin had returned to exploring the apartment and was now examining the few personal items Jake had on display. She picked up a framed photo of Jake and Han standing together on a hiking trip in the nearby mountains. "Han, enjoy your Earth wilderness," she said, her voice carrying a note of sadness. "He sent us many images." Jake walked over and looked at the picture. It had been taken just 2 months ago. Han's iridescent skin had been glowing with excitement as they reached the summit after a challenging climb. Jake had never seen his friend so happy. "He loved exploring," Jake said softly. He said the mountains here reminded him of the southern region of your homeworld. Jin nodded. The Crescent Range, where he died. The blunt statement brought back the reality of their situation. Han was gone, and Jake was now responsible for his 3 sisters, who were supposedly his wives. I should explain a few things about human customs, Jake said, taking a seat on his couch. Even if I were to accept this arrangement, humans don't practice polygamy, having multiple spouses. It's not legal in most places on Earth, including this diplomatic zone. Ju sat across from him, her posture perfect. Ambassador Ta has explained that there are legal exceptions for diplomatic personnel. Our unions would be recognized under Trilaxian law and honored through the cultural exchange provisions of the treaty. That's not really the point, Jake said. Legally possible doesn't make it culturally normal. People would stare, talk. It could affect my work, your integration here. Sun remained standing, her arms crossed. We are not concerned with the opinions of others. Family honor comes before social comfort. Are you actually willing to be married to someone you just met? Jake asked, looking at each sister in turn. Don't you want to choose your own partners? Jin sat beside him on the couch, keeping a respectful distance. Our concept of marriage differs from yours. The bond is about family, mutual support, and shared purpose. What humans call romantic love is a separate matter for us. In traditional Trilaxian partnerships, Ju explained, individuals may form romantic attachments with others outside the family bond, with the knowledge and approval of their bondmates. Jake's eyebrows rose. So it's not really marriage as humans understand it. It is and it isn't, Jin said. The closest human concept might be a combination of marriage, adoption, and business partnership. Jake let out a long breath. This is a lot to take in. Perhaps it would help to understand why Han chose you, Sun suggested, her tone softer than before. He believed you embodied the qualities most valuable to our culture. Loyalty, intelligence, adaptability, and kindness. Jin nodded. He told us how you defended Trilaxian interests in research meetings, even when other humans disagreed. How you learned our language when few others attempted it. How you respected our customs without judgment. Han saw in you what we call a compatible soul, Ju added. Someone whose values align with our own, despite cultural differences. Jake was touched by Han's faith in him, but still overwhelmed by the responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. 3 lives depended on his decision, and he had less than 3 days to make it. Let's take this one step at a time, he finally said. You can stay here while I consider everything. I'll take the couch. That is unnecessary. Sun began, but Jake held up his hand. On Earth, it's customary for a host to ensure guests are comfortable, even at personal inconvenience. Consider it your first lesson in human customs. A hint of a smile touched Jin's lips. Han said you were an excellent teacher. Jake stood up and went to gather bedding for the couch. As he passed Han's photo again, he could almost hear his friend's voice. Adaptability, Jake. It's the key to bridging our worlds. He just wished Han had given him some warning about exactly how much adapting he would need to do. 2 days had passed since the 3 Trilaxian sisters had moved into Jake's apartment. The small space had quickly transformed with their presence. Colorful Trilaxian fabrics now hung on the walls, strange-smelling herbs filled his kitchen, and the air hummed with the subtle resonance of their voices when they spoke to each other in their native language. Jake sat at his desk in the corner of the living room, reviewing the official report of Han's death for the 5th time. The document was frustratingly vague. Han had died during a routine ecological survey in the Crescent Mountains on Trilax. The cause was listed as environmental hazard, with no further details. Something doesn't add up, Jake muttered to himself. Han had been meticulous about safety protocols. He wouldn't have taken unnecessary risks, especially in a dangerous region like the Crescent Mountains. Jake, look at this, Ju called, her fingers dancing across Han's data tablet. The sisters had brought several of Han's personal belongings with them, including his personal data device. For the past day, Ju had been working to bypass the security measures and access the information inside. Jake got up and moved behind her, placing his hands on the back of the chair as he leaned forward to look at the screen. Ju's blue-green skin seemed to pulse with excitement. "You got in?" he asked, surprised. Ju nodded. "Han and I shared certain security protocols since childhood. I finally remembered the correct sequence." The tablet displayed a map of the Crescent Mountains, with several locations marked with glowing symbols. Han had added notes in Trilaxian script beside each marker. "Can you translate?" Jake asked, squinting at the unfamiliar symbols. "These are sampling locations," Ju explained, pointing to a series of blue markers. "But these red ones, they appear to be some kind of monitoring stations." Jake leaned closer. "These coordinates," he murmured. "This isn't where Han was supposed to be when he died." He pointed to a red marker deep in the mountains, far from the official survey area listed in the report. Sun joined them, her expression grim. "My brother was investigating something. Something dangerous." "What do you mean?" Jake asked, looking up at the tall, warrior-like sister. Sun's purple-silver skin darkened slightly. "Before he left for the last expedition, Han sent me a coded message. It was brief. Just a warning to be careful and to trust no one if anything happened to him." Jake straightened up. "And you're just mentioning this now?" "I needed to be certain of your intentions," Sun said without apology. "Han trusted you, but I needed to form my own judgment." Jin entered from the kitchen, carrying a tray with 4 steaming cups. Sun has always been protective. It is her nature. She set the tray down on the coffee table. "What have you found?" Ju tapped the tablet, bringing up a new screen filled with data. Han was collecting soil and air samples from these locations. According to his notes, he found traces of artificial compounds, something called TX-290. Jake's blood ran cold. TX-290 is a banned substance. It's a bioweapon that was developed during the early years of human Trilaxian contact, before the peace treaty. It's specifically designed to target Trilaxian physiology. All 3 sisters stared at him. "How do you know this?" Sun demanded. "I studied the history of human Trilaxian relations," Jake explained. TX-290 was one of the darkest chapters. Both sides developed weapons against each other before we realized peace was possible. All samples were supposedly destroyed when the treaty was signed. Jin's golden skin paled slightly. "If someone is producing this substance again, it could destroy the peace between our worlds," Jake finished. "If Han discovered this..." A sudden noise outside the apartment made them all freeze. The faint sound of footsteps in the hallway. Too many footsteps for a casual visitor. Sun moved with startling speed, pulling a small device from her robes and pressing it against the door. The device lit up red. "Energy weapons," she whispered. "At least 3 signatures." Jake's heart began to race. The diplomatic compound was supposed to be secure. Armed visitors weren't allowed without authorization and escorts. "Is there another way out?" Jin asked, her voice barely audible. Jake nodded toward the back of the apartment. "Emergency exit in the bedroom. All diplomatic housing has them." Sun moved to the bedroom door, checking the hallway beyond. Ju quickly shut down the tablet and tucked it into a hidden pocket in her robes. Jake grabbed a small bag from his desk drawer, his emergency kit with ID cards, credits, and a small communicator. He had always kept it ready, a habit from his field research days. He never thought he'd need it here. The apartment door exploded inward with a deafening bang. Jin screamed as masked figures rushed in, weapons drawn. There were 4 of them, wearing black protective gear that concealed all identifying features. Their weapons were unlike any Jake had seen before, not standard security issue. "Move." Jake grabbed the tablet from Ju's pocket, pulling the sisters toward the emergency exit in the bedroom. Sun was already holding the door open, her body tense and ready for combat. They rushed through the bedroom and into the narrow emergency corridor beyond. Red emergency lights cast an eerie glow along the passageway. "This leads to the maintenance level," Jake explained as they ran. "From there we can reach the vehicle bay." Behind them, shouts echoed as their pursuers discovered the escape route. "They're coming," Jin gasped, her golden skin now pale with fear. "Keep moving," Sun ordered, taking up the rear position. From within her robes, she produced what looked like a small silver rod. With a flick of her wrist, it extended into a staff-like weapon. "You're armed?" Jake asked in surprise as they continued to run. "Defense forces," Sun reminded him tersely. "I never travel unprepared." They reached the end of the corridor, and Jake punched in his security code to open the door to the maintenance level. The panel flashed green, and the door slid open, revealing a large area filled with environmental control equipment and storage containers. "This way," Jake directed, leading them toward a service elevator at the far end. "It goes directly to the vehicle bay." They had crossed half the distance when the door behind them burst open. Two of the masked figures appeared, weapons raised. "Down," Sun shouted, pushing Jake and her sisters behind a large air processing unit. Energy blasts sizzled through the air, striking equipment around them. Alarms began to wail as damage sensors detected the attack. "Who are they?" Jin cried, covering her head as sparks showered down from a damaged control panel. "I don't know," Jake answered, "but they're after Han's data." He clutched the tablet tightly against his chest. Sun edged around the corner of their shelter and thrust her staff forward. A pulse of energy shot from its tip, striking one of the attackers and sending him crashing into the wall. "The elevator is too exposed," Ju observed, her scientific calm somehow intact despite the danger. "Is there another route?" Jake thought quickly. "Maintenance tunnels. They run beneath the entire compound." He pointed to a hatch in the floor about 20 meters away. "Through there." Sun nodded. "I'll cover you. Go on my signal." She took a deep breath, then stepped out from behind cover, her staff spinning in complex patterns as she deflected energy blasts and returned fire. "Now," she shouted. Jake grabbed Jin's hand and ran for the hatch, with Ju close behind. Energy blasts scorched the floor around them as they ran. Jake dropped to his knees at the hatch, quickly entering another security code. The heavy metal cover slid aside, revealing a ladder descending into darkness. "Go," he urged, helping Jin onto the ladder first, then Ju. Sun backed toward them, still deflecting attacks with remarkable skill. When she reached the hatch, she dropped something small on the ground before leaping into the opening after her sisters. Jake followed quickly, pulling the hatch closed above him. Just before it sealed, he saw a bright flash of light and heard the attackers cry out. "Stun grenade," Sun explained as they descended the ladder. "Small radius, but effective." They reached the bottom of the ladder and found themselves in a dimly lit tunnel. Pipes and conduits ran along the ceiling and walls, carrying power, data, and environmental support throughout the compound. "Which way?" Ju asked, looking at the tunnel stretching in both directions. Jake pointed to the right. "That leads to the perimeter. There's a maintenance exit that opens outside the compound." As they hurried along the tunnel, Jake's mind raced. Armed attackers in a diplomatic compound meant high-level clearance or inside help. Han's discovery must have been even more dangerous than they had realized. Han knew, Jake said as they moved through the darkness. He knew someone was developing banned bioweapons, and they killed him for it. "But why send us to you?" Jin asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Why not report his findings through official channels?" "Because he didn't know who to trust," Jake realized, "and he needed someone to protect you." As they fled into the night, Jake realized the truth. Han hadn't burdened him with his sisters. He'd entrusted Jake to protect them. The pieces suddenly fit together. Han had known his sisters would be targets too if his enemies discovered how much he had told them. By naming Jake as their husband under Trelaxian law, he had placed them under the protection of someone he trusted completely, someone outside the normal chains of command. "We need to get off compound and find somewhere safe," Jake said as they approached the maintenance exit. "Then we need to figure out who's behind this and who we can trust." Sun nodded grimly. "And then we will avenge my brother." Jake didn't correct her. For the first time since receiving Han's strange inheritance, he felt certain of his path forward. Han had trusted him with what he valued most, his family. Jake wouldn't let him down. The safe house was small, but it had become home over the weeks in hiding. Located in the foothills outside the main settlement, the simple 3-room structure had once been a research outpost for studying local flora. Now it served as refuge for Jake and the 3 Trelaxian sisters. Jake stood in the center of the main room, his body sore but determined as he tried to copy Sun's movements. The furniture had been pushed against the walls to create an open practice space. Like this, Sun demonstrated the defensive stance again, her patience remarkable as she guided Jake through Trelaxian combat forms. Her purple-silver skin gleamed with a subtle glow as she moved with fluid precision. Weight balanced, center low, arms ready to deflect or strike. Jake adjusted his posture, trying to mirror her stance. After 3 weeks of daily training, he was finally beginning to grasp the basics of Trelaxian self-defense. His muscles protested, but he pushed through the discomfort. "Better," Sun acknowledged with a slight nod. "Now the blocking sequence." She moved toward him in a swift attack pattern. Jake responded with the blocks she had taught him, his movements still clumsy compared to her grace, but effective enough to deflect her strikes. "You learn quickly for a human," Sun said, stepping back. There was newfound respect in her voice. "I have a good teacher," Jake replied with a smile. When they had first arrived at the safe house, Sun had barely spoken to him. She had been cold, suspicious, focused only on protecting her sisters. But as days passed into weeks, her rigid exterior had gradually softened. The training sessions had become their way of building trust. From the small kitchen area, Ju called out, "I found something." Jake and Sun moved to join her at the table where Han's data tablet sat connected to a makeshift analysis station Ju had assembled from spare parts. Her blue-green fingers danced across the screens as she sorted through complex data sets. Han discovered a weapons exchange. "Someone is arming extremists from both worlds," Ju explained, pointing to a series of transaction records and location data. These shipments contain components for TX-290 and similar bioweapons. Jake leaned over her shoulder, studying the information. "Can you identify who's behind it?" Ju's skin rippled with frustration. "Not directly. They use multiple shell companies and proxies. But I've traced patterns that suggest involvement from both human and Trelaxian officials." "Which explains why Han didn't know who to trust," Jake said, running a hand through his hair. In the 3 weeks since their escape from the diplomatic compound, they had been careful to remain hidden, using only secure communication channels to reach out to potential allies. Jin nodded. "On Trelax, we have a concept called tasheral, the complexity that creates beauty. Like how many notes together form a harmony more beautiful than any single sound." Jake smiled at the concept. "Tasheral, I like that. Han used to say that human-Trelaxian relations were the ultimate tasheral, complex, sometimes discordant, but with the potential for unprecedented beauty. He never told me that." "He showed you instead," Jin said, "by bringing us together." Inside the house, they heard Ju call out excitedly. They hurried back inside to find her pointing at the screen. "I've identified one of the key conspirators," she announced. "A human official named Victor Reyes. He's been coordinating shipments from both ends." "Reyes?" Jake frowned. "He's on the Diplomatic Security Council. He has access to everything in the compound, including the ability to send armed teams after us," Sun added grimly. "We need to add this to the evidence for Dr. Patel," Jake said. "This could be the connection we need to expose the entire operation." As they gathered around the table to review the new information, Jake felt a strange sense of rightness. 4 individuals from different worlds, brought together by tragedy, now working as a seamless unit toward a common goal. Han would be proud, Jin said softly, clearly sensing his thoughts. Jake nodded. I think he planned this all along. He knew what we could become together. A family. Sun said, the word sounding less foreign on her lips than it would have weeks ago. A family. Jake agreed, no longer afraid of what that meant. Outside, night had fallen completely, stars emerging in the clear sky. Tomorrow would bring danger as they moved to expose the conspiracy. But tonight, in their small safe house hidden in the foothills, they had found something none of them had expected. A sense of belonging that transcended the boundaries of their different worlds. The grand hall of the Earth Trilaxian Diplomatic Center buzzed with tension and excitement. Journalists from both worlds crowded against the barriers, cameras and recording devices, capturing every moment of this historic gathering. Officials in formal attire sat in neat rows, their expressions ranging from relief to lingering suspicion. Jake stood at the edge of the platform, still not quite believing they had made it to this moment. The past month had been a blur of danger, revelations, and finally justice. Their meeting with Dr. Patel had been the turning point, setting in motion a careful operation that exposed the conspiracy without triggering interspecies conflict. The treaty stands, announced the human ambassador, her voice firm as security forces led away the conspirators, thanks to the evidence provided by Jake Matthews and his family. The ambassador hesitated slightly on the word family, still adjusting to the unprecedented arrangement. Victor Reyes and his co-conspirators, 3 humans and 2 Trilaxians, were being escorted from the hall in restraints. Their plan to destroy the Alliance with bioweapon attacks designed to trigger war between the species had been thwarted just days before execution. Jake stood tall beside Ju, Sun, and Jin, their hands linked in the traditional Trilaxian family chain. The gesture, once strange to him, now felt natural, a physical manifestation of their connection. Ju's blue-green skin shimmered under the bright lights, her scientific composure intact despite the attention. Sun stood proudly, her warrior bearing unmistakable even in formal robes. Jin's golden skin glowed warmly, her empathic presence a calming influence on them all. What happens now? Asked a reporter, rising from her seat with recorder extended. Jake looked at his 3 bondmates, receiving subtle nods of encouragement. They had discussed this moment, knowing their response would shape perceptions of their unusual family. Now, Jake replied, we build something new together. The ambassador stepped forward again. In recognition of their service to both our worlds, the Joint Council has approved a special diplomatic status for Jake Matthews and his Trilaxian bondmates. They will serve as cultural liaisons, helping to navigate the complexities of our deepening alliance. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Such an arrangement was unprecedented. While the treaty technically allowed for cross-species unions, none had been formally recognized at this diplomatic level before. Additionally, the Trilaxian ambassador added, her iridescent skin shifting colors as she spoke, Han's final research will not be forgotten. The Joint Scientific Committee will establish a research center in his name, dedicated to ethical cross-species biological studies. The press conference continued, but Jake found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. From the shock of Han's death to the confusion of suddenly having 3 alien wives, through danger and discovery to this moment of public recognition, it seemed impossible that only 2 months had passed. You're thinking of Han, Jin whispered beside him, her empathic abilities picking up his emotional state. Jake nodded slightly. Han should have been here, should have seen his work completed, his family safe. The ceremony concluded with the formal signing of documents that officially recognized their unique family status under both human and Trilaxian law. What had begun as an emergency measure to protect Han's sisters had evolved into something entirely new, a bridge between cultures embodied in 4 individuals. 3 months later, Jake stood in the central room of their new home, carefully placing Han's memorial crystal on a specially designed pedestal. The house, located on the outskirts of the diplomatic compound, had been constructed to accommodate both species comfortably. High ceilings and large windows satisfied Trelaxian preferences for space and light, while human-style furnishings provided the comfort Jake needed. "Perfect," Jin said, adjusting the position of the crystal slightly. When activated, it would project a holographic image of Han and play recordings of his voice, a Trelaxian tradition for honoring the dead. Their new life had settled into rhythms that would have seemed impossible to Jake just months ago. Their diplomatic duties kept them busy, helping to smooth interactions between humans and Trelaxians as the alliance deepened. Each brought unique skills to this work. Jake's anthropological knowledge, Ju's scientific expertise, Sun's understanding of security protocols, and Jin's empathic abilities to sense tension or confusion. "The garden sensors are installed," Ju announced, entering the room with a tablet displaying diagrams of the property. "They'll monitor soil and air quality to ensure optimal conditions for both Earth and Trelaxian plants." Sun followed, carrying a small security panel. "Perimeter measures are active as well. Not that we expect trouble, but caution remains wise." The conspiracy had been thoroughly dismantled, with all major participants identified and detained. Yet Sun's protective instincts remained sharp, a trait Jake had come to appreciate rather than question. "Will you activate it?" Jin asked, gesturing to Han's memorial crystal. Jake touched the base of the crystal, and it began to glow. Light spilled outward, forming the image of Han as Jake had known him, tall and dignified, with iridescent skin that shifted between blues and greens. The hologram smiled, looking around as if taking in the gathered family. "Greetings," Han's voice filled the room. "If you are viewing this, then my contingency plans have been implemented. I hope my research has proven useful, and that my family has found safety." Jake felt a tightness in his throat. This recording had been made before Han's final expedition, his precaution in case the worst happened. "To my sisters," the hologram continued, "I entrust you to my friend Jake Matthews, a human of exceptional character." And to Jake, the hologram seemed to look directly at him. "I ask forgiveness for the burden I may have placed upon you. Know that I would not have chosen this path if I had seen any alternative." Jin moved closer to Jake, her hand slipping into his. The physical contact amplified her empathic abilities, allowing her to share his grief and help process it. "He would be pleased," Ju said, her hand resting on Jake's shoulder, "not just with the exposure of the conspiracy, but with how we have honored his vision." "He gave us more than safety," Jin added. "He gave us understanding." Sun nodded. "Two worlds, one family." Jake gazed at the three women who had entered his life through an alien law, but remained by choice and connection. What had begun as an impossible situation had transformed into something none of them could have imagined. The intercom chimed, announcing their first visitors to the new home. Dr. Patel and several colleagues from the diplomatic corps, coming to celebrate the house completion. "Ready?" Jake asked, looking at each of his bondmates. They moved toward the entrance together, no longer in the formal Trelaxian chain, but in the more casual arrangement they had developed. Connected but individual, united but distinct. As they welcomed their guests, Jake noticed the looks of curiosity, some still tinged with confusion. Human-Trelaxian relations had taken many forms since first contact, but nothing quite like this had emerged before. Later, as their home filled with voices from both worlds, Jake found himself on the terrace, taking a moment of quiet. The night sky above showed stars that humans and Trelaxians had both named differently, now being explored together. "Content?" Sun asked, joining him. Her question was simple, but carried depths of meaning. Of the three sisters, she had been the most resistant initially, the most protective of Trelaxian traditions. "Yes," Jake answered honestly. "Not what I expected from life. But worthy." Sun finished for him, using a Trelaxian concept that meant more than the English word could convey. Worthy of effort, worthy of pride, worthy of one's life path. Inside, Jake could hear Jin explaining Trelaxian emotion terms to fascinated human linguists, While Ju debated scientific protocols with researchers from both worlds, their home had become exactly what Han might have envisioned, a living laboratory for cross-cultural understanding. The memorial crystal still glowed in the center of the main room, Han's image watching over the gathering with what Jake could swear was a satisfied expression. Family was always more than blood to him, Sun said, following Jake's gaze. And to us, Jake added, realizing how true it had become. What had begun as an inheritance, strange, unwanted, frightening, had evolved into something chosen and cherished. Together they had created something unique in the history of human Trilaxian relations, not just an alliance of convenience or diplomatic necessity, but a true blending of worlds at the most fundamental level. As they rejoined their guests, Jake caught glimpses of the future they were building. One conversation, one shared meal, one cultural exchange at a time. Humanity's first Trilaxian family was just the beginning.